Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon. My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here, and as many of you know who've been coming to this series regularly, this is a 14-part lecture series that is essentially celebrating the permanent collection in the East Building, since it's the 40th anniversary of the opening of the East Building. So today, I'm going to talk about Dada and Surrealism, two of the most important movements in the 20th century. And I'm showing you here on the screen one of the Dada magazine's manifestos from 1918. That was from the French, the Parisian version of Dada. Dada was very international. And then I'm showing you, of course, the very famous first issue of the Surrealist Revolution, this is the issue where André Breton publishes the first Surrealist Manifesto, which is in 1924. So for the beginnings of Surrealism, we have a very firm date. It starts in 1924 with the publication of this manifesto, and at that point, there is no such thing as Surrealist painting. Nobody ever heard of it. So then the artists have to try to create the paintings that go along with the ideas that Breton espoused here. But let's start with Dada. It's almost impossible to talk about Dada without Surrealism and vice versa. They go together hand in glove. So they're always talked about and discussed together. Even many of the same artists will start with Dada and they'll end up with Surrealism. There's a real flow back and forth among these artists. So really the two movements go together very, very tightly. Dada is essentially nihilistic. It is anarchistic. It is against everything. And so it is especially against all previous forms of artistic or literary or cultural expression. In this particular journal, you see this phrase, this sentence in French, that we actually think Descartes said, but I'm not actually sure about that. But we know Tristan Tzara, who was the great poet of Dada, believed this, and what that says is, kind of reading from here, going up, is I don't even want to know if there have been men before me. In other words, I don't care what came before me. It doesn't matter, because we're destroying everything. So that's sort of what you see on the front. They want to make history a tabula rasa. We're going to start fresh from the beginning. They certainly did have a relationship to things in the recent past, so it wasn't that they were totally ahistorical, but for the most part, they're starting fresh. So what is Dada? Well, there have been obviously volumes on this, so I'm going to just give you a kind of laundry list of some of the ideas and precepts and concepts that underlie Dada. It is anti-national, so it is against countries, America, France, Germany. It's anti-national, so you might say it's supranational, wants to sort of go beyond nationalism. To that extent, it's global, and it functions as a network. So there's a communication of ideas between and among artists of Dada and cities of Dada, using all means of modern expression, media. So this would include cinema, newsreels, the radio, graphic design, posters, any way that one could communicate. It would include the mail, the postal service, sending things through the mail, letters, broadsides, and especially manifestos. We're getting into the realm now in the 20th century. If you'll recall, I said that Cubism and Fauvism had no manifestos. There was nothing literary that you were supposed to study before you figured out what Cubism was about or Fauvism. Now we're getting into the age of the manifesto. Now everybody's writing a manifesto. So we have a Futurist manifesto, a Dada manifesto, a Surrealist manifesto, De Stijl manifesto. It goes on and on and on. And this gets to be very dense in some cases. Okay. It is certainly synonymous with protest. Dada is protest. Dada arises as a direct response to the carnage of the First World War. So without the First World War having been such a catastrophic, cataclysmic, horrific event, Dada might have taken a different, if it had existed at all. So here's a photograph on the left from the First World War. This is an American soldier who has died on the fence that separates the trenches in no man's land. And on the right are some soldiers who have suffered from mustard gas, the use of poison gas, and their faces are being bandaged in their hands until they can be transported back to a hospital. So Dada comes right out of this carnage of the First World War. It has an incredibly powerful sense of disgust that's associated with all things political, linguistic, cultural, anything that could have been used and was used to justify that war. So all the jingoism, you know, phrases like the war to make the world safe for democracy, the war to end all wars, this drove them to complete and total disgust, that we could think that war would be a means to this kind of end. So to that extent, they saw language being used in a way that was a betrayal. This jingoism, speeches, slogans, rhetoric, to try to get people to come along and believe in this war, that it was something that had to be fought, that kind of thing. It was to them a total hypocrisy. So in the realm of art, art must not look away. This is Tristan Tzara, who was one of the poets and founders of the Dada movement. By the way, both of these movements, Dada and Surrealism, are literary movements first, not visual arts movements. They're literary movements. So Tristan Tzara said, art must not look away, art needs an operation, and then most famously what he said, and I think this is the way you have to think of Dada. You cannot think of Dada as a style. If you think of Dada as a style, you're going to be in, it's going to cause a lot of sleepless nights. You have to think about it as what is being said here. So Tzara himself said famously, Dada is a state of mind. And I think that's how you have to think about it. You don't think about, well, gee, that's not a Dada style, and Duchamp was different than this and that. You can't think like that. So the feeling Dada had was that the very culture that could give rise to this kind of destruction and conflagration, it had to be humiliated, it had to be humbled, it had to be brought to its knees. This culture, this society that produced this had to be brought to its knees. And Dada would use many of the same means of communication that politicians had used and governments had used, all of these new means of communication, the newsreel, film, radio, newspapers, manifestos, the whole gamut. So the modern shock of the war would be answered by the shock of Dada. Dada would be also a sort of shock as its weapon. Now here, when we go up to the upper level, this is our new installation of the room devoted, or at least part of the room that's devoted to Dada. And sometimes you have to, you know how much I love these wall texts, but sometimes you have to kind of fudge and cast a wide net in order to get everybody into the same place, so to speak. So here, notice it's Dada and beyond. So when you're in this space, there's much more beyond Dada than there is in Dada. So you just have to give us a break, you know. We can only go as far as our collection sort of goes. In any case, there are some significant things here that directly pertain to Dada. Directly or indirectly, I would say that Dada influences just about every form of expression in contemporary art. So that would be as well, not just in the visual arts, it would be in literature, theater, music as well. It's that important. So among the strategies of Dada, the things these artists explore, when I go through this list, I mean, you can apply these things to almost any later contemporary art movement. So first would be certainly the use of abstraction, collage and assemblage, the use of montage, as we have in cinema, exploration of the accident and chance in art, a stress on process as opposed to finished product, the exploration of indigenous cultures from Africa, America, Oceania, the prominence of women in the movement, extending the concepts of abstraction into film and literature, the notion of art as performance, the appropriation of elements from popular culture, the notion of the interaction and confrontation in art with an audience, provoking an audience, being hostile to the audience, being aggressive to the audience, shocking the audience, that kind of idea. which makes all of us who are in the audience participants in the performance. The use of the ready-made, found objects, the exploration of surrogacy for the human form, which would include things like mannequins, dummies, dolls, puppets, and automatons. I can show you all the movements where those things pertain later into the 21st century, but they all owe something to Dada. The visual movements affected by Dada will include things like surrealism, constructivism, pop art, op art, conceptual art, performance art, minimalism. They all owe something to Dada. And beyond the visual arts, when you go further into European and American culture, things like the beat poets, punk rock, guerrilla theater, theater of the absurd, 1960s protest, mock trials, commercial art, advertising, all of these things that are used as weapons later are all indebted to Dada. So there isn't much Dada didn't affect. Very often when one goes to exhibitions today and everybody gets all their nose out of joint because somebody's doing something provocative or whatever, you know, I go and I just say, well, you know, that was done in 1920 by the Dada artists. That was done at the Cafe or the Cabaret Voltaire, or it was done here, it was done there. It's pretty hard to be original today in that particular sense. Now, Dada emerges from 6 major cities, urban centers. It comes from Zurich, Berlin, Hanover, Cologne, New York, and Paris. It emerges in all those cities at the same time. 2 of the most important happen to be, at least at the start of the war, neutral cities. Zurich and New York did not participate in the First World War. Eventually, America does enter the war. In each city there was a manifestation of Dada that was slightly different than one of its sister cities. Zurich was pivotal because Dada really begins in Zurich with the founding of the so-called Cabaret Voltaire. It was kind of a cafe cabaret that was opened on February 5th, 1916 by a number of people. Hugo Ball was particularly important, B-A-L-L, Hugo Ball. And this became a nexus, a locus for revolution, for rebuke, for nihilistic activities. To go to the Cabaret Voltaire was an incredibly exciting experience because you really didn't know what the hell was going to happen. I mean, there were performances, there were sound poems, there was noise, there were people doing things, people shooting off guns. I mean, it was just a total sort of visceral kind of craziness. There was a very famous, when the Dada artists, again, remember, most of the initiators of Dada are involved with language and literature, not with the visual arts. So there would be these sound poems. The Dada artists just sort of created their own language, their own syntax, where you just repeated certain syllables and things. There was a very important performance by Hugo Ball. He wore this big kind of, I should have brought in a picture. He kind of looked like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz. It was this big constructed costume. He couldn't actually walk in it, so they had to pick him up and put him on the stage. And then he just would start this sound poem that would go on and on and on and on. And after a while, you just started to go off into some other world, just based on the repetition of sounds and things like that. Zurich Dada explored abstraction. They explored process, the effects of chance. They were certainly interested in indigenous cultures. Performance art, or these sound poems that I was just mentioning, are very important in Zurich. And a certain aggression to the audience, so a certain kind of confrontation with the audience. Hugo Ball, who founded this cabaret, said, quote, "Our cabaret, Cabaret Voltaire, is a gesture. Every word that is spoken and sung here says at least this one thing, that this humiliating age has not succeeded in winning our respect." They chose the name Voltaire because he was the great French philosopher from the Enlightenment, and of course this was going to be anything but reasonable at the cabaret, but they thought it would fool people into thinking, well, this is a good place, let's go to the Cabaret Voltaire and talk about the Enlightenment, but that's not what happened. These are 2 works by, well, he was Alsatian, so it's either, if you want to go by the German, it's Hans, or French, it's Jean Arp, A-R-P. And it's the one on the left is untitled, but then it does actually have a subtitle, Squares Arranged According to the Laws of Chance, from 1917. This is not an art collection, this is from MoMA. It's cut and pasted colored paper on colored paper. And then a sort of wooden version of the same idea on the right is titled Objects Arranged According to the Law of Chance from 1930. Chance, the accident, was very important to Dada, so they explored this in many different ways. And what art began to do was to take sheets of paper and not using scissors, but just using his hands, he would just tear them up into various squares, and then he would put a piece of paper down on the floor, and then he'd just let these things flutter down, and then they would fall on the other piece of paper, and then he would attach them, fix them to the paper the way they fell. Now, if you believe that, I've got some land in Florida. Because that's what he said. But I'm sure he would like kick one over a little bit and then put it over here, and because I don't think he was just like totally, Some of them he was able to rip. Even this one on the left, they kind of have clean edges, even though they're torn. Others have these real, broken edges because he's tearing it. Depends on the type of paper. And then he did the same thing with these wood pieces where he'd put a piece of wood on the floor, he'd have these other blocks of wood, and he'd just drop them, so-called according to the laws of chance, and then he would fix them. So the idea of the accident was very important, and of abstraction was very important in Zurich Dada. We have these works by Arp. These are not according to the laws of chance. This is The Forest on the left from 1916. And one of my favorites is Shirt Front and Fork on the right from 1922. Some of his best deal with the theme of the navel, your belly button. Have this thing and it'll have a little hole, and that's the belly button. It's really great. So these are carved and painted wood, but clearly these are not accidental or affected by chance. But they are common materials. They're wood, they're painted wood. They're not cut in a particularly sophisticated way. They have sort of rough edges. And they're essentially a kind of collage in many ways. So this is Zurich. Germany is a little different, and we have Dada in 3 German cities, Berlin, Hanover, and Cologne. This is the great photograph on the left of the grand opening of the first Dada exhibition in Berlin on June 5th, 1920. I don't know how many of you saw our Dada exhibition. Anybody here who saw the Dada exhibition? Oh, gosh.
It was great.
It's one of the greatest exhibitions I've ever seen at the National Gallery of Art, without a doubt, ever since I've been coming. We recreated this room on the left for the Berlin section of the show. See, this is where I get into trouble. I think, that one was like 2 years ago. And then I look and it was like 15 years ago. Well, look up that catalog. The catalog is still out there. It's a great catalog. In any case, this was Berlin here. There was this effigy figure hanging from the ceiling that showed a German officer with the head of a pig. And then we have not all, but most of the important members of Berlin Dada, which include 2 very important figures who are over here as well, Raoul Hausmann and Hannah Höch, right here. And here they are again. And Hannah Höch is in front of her great collage, her great photo montage right here that I'll show you in a second. George Gross is in this picture, John Hertfield, they're all there. In any case, Berlin Dada was about radical politics, and it was essentially about leftist politics. It was tied strongly, it had a strong communist sort of undertone. It was challenging the rule of the Kaiser from the Weimar Republic. It was, of course, this was a period of tremendous pain and suffering, incredible inflation. After the war, certainly Germany had been just so crushed by the reparations they had to pay to the Allies. So the economy was tanking. It cost, I'm exaggerating here, but it cost like 3 million marks to buy a loaf of bread. That's how bad the inflation rates were. There were few social services for the returning veterans. There was poverty, there was hunger, there was unemployment. This, of course, as you all know, is what laid the groundwork for the rise of National Socialism, obviously, in the 30s. So Berlin Dada was tied very much to that kind of political disruption. So here is, again, very important, these two individuals, Haussmann and Hannah Hawk. I'll come back to her in a second. Cologne Dada was different. It wasn't so much communist, it was anarchist. So it favored a real kind of nihilistic, anarchistic kind of concept about confronting society, politics, concepts of art. The figure that was the leader there was Max Ernst, the German artist. He was the leader. He organized the very famous 1920 Dada Fair in Cologne. Each city had a Dada Fair, so this is Berlin. But there was one in Cologne, and the one when Max Ernst organized that, you had to enter, it took place in a beer hall, but you had to go through the men's toilet to get there. And then when you came to the entrance, there was a statue that he had made that was at the entrance that had an axe tied to it with a rope. And you were supposed to smash the exhibits then, take the axe and certainly smash that statue. So that's pretty nihilistic. We wouldn't allow that at the National Gallery. There was a young girl who was she looked very virginal. She was dressed in a wedding gown, and she was reading the most obscene poems out loud during this. So, in fact, the police closed this exhibition almost immediately. It opened and then it closed. They raided it and closed it down. But then it was actually the Cologne government, which was fairly lenient. They allowed it to reopen shortly thereafter. So it did reopen after being initially closed. This is Hannah Hawk on the left. We were just talking about her in Berlin. And this is arguably her greatest work. Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Beer Belly of the Weimar Republic. That's the title, 1919. This is her cutting through the patriarchal society of the Weimar Republic. It's a direct piece of criticism that's leveled against this attempt to impose democracy in the Weimar Republic, all the failures, all of the weak politicians, etc. So she's chastising everybody through this photo montage. Photo montage is not just a collage, but it's actually taking photographs as well as paper and things and cutting them up and using them. So this is one of the most iconic Dada collages in Western art history by Hannah Hawk. On the right is the man who was most associated not with Dada in Berlin or in Cologne, but in Hanover. And this is Kurt Schwitters. Schwitters is a little bit different. In Hanover, Dada was a little less confrontational, a little less aggressive, and this is especially true with Schwitters. This work on the right is called Merz Picture 25A. Merz is spelled M-E-R-Z. It's the word in German Kommerz that he cut in half, and he took the back part of the word Kommerz and used it as a sort of title for all of his works. Later he creates these large installations that are called Merzbau. They're these huge sort of installations you can walk into. But this is a collage or an assemblage. It's called Merz Picture 25A, subtitled The Star Picture from 1920. Schwitters was a little less hostile, and he was more about the belief that politics, that art, if it existed at all, should exist on a higher plane and not even be involved in politics. Politics was so beneath art and these problems that many Dada artists were dealing with, that art should aspire to something more spiritual, but also deal with direct statements of the world that we're in. So his collages are these most beautiful, subtle, nostalgic things, because the objects that he finds, a train ticket, a tram ticket, a stub from a theater, a bill from a cafe, all these things that he incorporates are so evocative of a time and of a place that they really are quite moving. The American artist who loved Schwitters was Joseph Cornell. So Cornell would look at Schwitters very closely for that same kind of reason. So briefly, Hanover, Cologne, Berlin, Zurich. Then we come to New York and to Paris. So here's a poster on the left that's at MoMA in New York by Richard Boix, called Dada, the New York Dada Group. And you see some of the main protagonists, most especially down here playing chess, is Marcel Duchamp. Here's Man Ray here. And then this is a photograph of the Parisian members of Parisian Paris Dada around 1922. So here's New York and Paris, the other two cities. New York was, as I said, a neutral city, like Zurich, initially at least, until we entered the war. And the three main figures that dominate New York Dada are Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, and Francis Picabia, these three artists, although there is tremendous fluidity between the time they spend in Paris and then coming to New York, so they kind of go back and forth. The last phase of Dada, after the war takes place in Paris, you get a lot of people attracted to the movement. These are some of them over here. This is Tristan Tzara here. Man Ray took the photograph, so he has a friend holding a picture of him here. Paul Eluard, Sue Paul. I mean, most of these people, almost all those people, are poets and writers. So the last phase of Dada, after the war takes place in Paris, and then you start to see the emergence, or he had already been on the scene in Paris. At first, it's not really a confrontation, but the collaboration, I guess, between Tristan Tzara and André Breton. They're both poets. Tristan Tzara has been the mouthpiece for Dada. André Breton is now challenging some of the ideas of Dada and wants to see them put into a different kind of format and shape. So eventually, out of this group of Parisian Dada artists and others, Breton moves us into surrealism when he publishes in 1924 the Surrealist Manifesto. And then you do have conflict between Tzara and Breton about who's the boss, this kind of thing. Ultimately, Breton wins. He becomes the Pope of surrealism. He expels people and brings people in, kicks them out. I mean, now let's talk a little bit about New York, but specifically let's talk about probably, arguably, certainly one of the most important artists of the 20th century, Marcel Duchamp. Just like you can't really escape a lot of Dada concepts, you cannot escape Duchamp. I mean, I don't care what kind of artist you are. Either you want to kill the guy, stab him, and you have to kill him to go on, or you believe in everything that he stood for, so there's not much in between. This is sort of like the question at the turn of the century when people would ask, if you asked a young sculptor in Paris at 1900, what do you think of Rodin? He was not going to say, Rodin, I've never really thought of him. He was either going to say, this guy is done, I hate him, he's 19th century, he's old-fashioned, I got to kill this guy to move on. Or you would say, oh my God, he's a god, I want to work with him. If he would take me into his studio, I would love it. So there was no ambivalence, and that's true for artists subsequent to Marcel Duchamp. But where Duchamp starts and where he ends up are obviously two different places. So here's Portrait of the Artist's Father on the left from 1910 by Duchamp, and The Chess Game on the right from 1910. Of course, the one-stop shopping for Marcel Duchamp's art, you only need to go to one place. That's Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Museum of Art has the largest collection of Duchamp. Both of these works are in Philadelphia. He was very close to Catherine Dreyer, who was a patron, and she was connected to Philadelphia. She left all of her collection to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So here we see Duchamp's father. He's painting his father, 1910. Duchamp is 23 years old. And of course, what he's painting here is his interest in who? Cézanne. We've been through this a million times. Cézanne. Everybody's got to go through Cézanne. There's no off-ramp before Cézanne. He had died in 1907, 1906. The retrospective was in 1907. And among all these famous quotes, father of us all, mother of us all, etc., Picasso, Matisse, Duchamp said the same thing, that he was the father of us all. So he's even cribbing from father was Picasso, right? Mother was Matisse. So Duchamp describes this portrait, quote, a typical illustration of my cult for Cézanne mixed up with filial love. So Duchamp had an affectionate relationship with his father. They were close. His father supported him in his desires to be an artist. He gave him stipends and allowance to allow him to pursue his art. So it's a tribute to both men, to Cézanne and also to his father. Of course, his father supported the whole family, And Duchamp had two brothers, and you may or may not know this, but they didn't all want to be referred to by the same name because then everybody would confuse which Duchamp are you talking about. So they each took a different variation of family names. One took the name of both the mother and father's side. So he was Raymond Duchamp Villon. The other one just took the I think it was the mother's side. That's Jacques Villon. And then Marcel just took the father's side, Marcel Duchamp. They're all brothers. But they didn't want to be mixed up by people, so that's the way they referred to themselves. So here, playing chess, is Raymond Duchamp Villon here on the left. We have a wonderful sculpture by him that's off view. It's this torso figure. And then this is Jacques Villon over here on the right. He has a very lovely kind of, the brothers have a wonderful, lovely sort of childhood on Normandy. They were raised around Rouen in Normandy. It was the land of Flaubert, Madame Bovary, all of this, and Duchamp loved especially the writings of Gustave Flaubert. But both of these owe a lot, of course, obviously to Cézanne. And then obviously, once you get through Cézanne, of course, people tend to move to Cubism, and that's what we have with Duchamp. So here are the brothers. In that photograph, this is Jacques Villon, this is Marcel Duchamp there, and then Jacques Villon and Raymond Duchamp Villon. So the three, and their dog, who was named Pipe, but that may be Pipe, I'm not sure. This photograph is 1913. Of course, the brothers have a little bit of sibling rivalry, but on March 18th, 1912, Duchamp received a visit from his brothers. They came to see him in his studio in France, and they told him that the painting he had submitted for this exhibition that they were on the jury for, which was at the Salon des Indépendants in Paris, that they had rejected the painting. And the painting they rejected was this painting. The Nude Descending the Staircase, number 2. Both of his brothers were essentially Cubist painters, but they refused the painting on the grounds that, quote, a nude never descends the stairs. A nude reclines. So Marcel Duchamp was furious. He was so angry at his brothers for rejecting it. So he did end up submitting it to a different exhibition in Paris, so that it did get eventually shown. But then, of course, he decided to send it to New York for the Armory show. Now, this painting has all kinds of. This is a major painting by Duchamp, one of the most important in the 20th century. Before he finally leaves this whole idea of traditional retinal painting behind. He does eventually send this to the Armory show in New York in 1913. Of course, it invokes all kinds of jokes and caricatures. I'll come back to some of these, but the American Art News actually offered a $10 reward to the first reader who could actually find the nude, find the woman descending the stairs. Then there was a famous cartoon that said it was not the nude descending the staircase, it was the rude descending the staircase, and then subtitled Rush Hour at the Subway. Then another said it was an explosion in a shingle factory. And of course, Duchamp loved this. He loved all of this kind of sarcasm. The painting owes a lot to the Italian futurists. Sometimes we call this painting Cubo-futurist. It owes certainly something to Cubism, but also something to Italian futurism. But it owes a lot to photography and to the new sequential photography of Etienne Jules Marais in France, but also Muybridge in the United States, even to photographs by Thomas Eakins, the American painter. But it's particularly relevant to this work by Muybridge, which was Animal Locomotion, that he had published in 1887, which showed various humans and animals in various stages of movement. This is the book that proved that when a horse runs at a certain speed, all 4 legs are up off the ground at the same time. I can't go into that whole story. It's another great story. In any case, certainly Duchamp was aware of this this work, studied it, and here's what people were. This is what Muybridge was thinking about, and of course she turns and goes down and up this staircase. So he sends it off to the Armory show, which we've already talked about. I've already showed you this imagery here. That takes place between February and March 1913 in New York City, but then it travels to Chicago and Boston. It has works by all the leading artists of the day from Europe. This was the table devoted to Brancusi here. This is the work, Madame Pogany, that was particularly sort of ridiculed, again, in that same magazine, Art Revolutions. No, this is a different magazine. Art Revolutionists of Today from 1913. The writer describing this work by Brancusi said, quote, actually, it was the caption under this photograph. This photograph was the photograph in the magazine, in the newspaper. At the left of the picture is a much-discussed portrait bust of Madame Pogany, a dancer, by Brancusi. This freak sculpture resembles nothing so much as an egg and has excited much derision and laughter. Then somebody else said it looked like an egg on top of a sugar cube. So I showed you these things last time when we talked about Robert Henry and Stiglitz, all the different sarcasm, art at the Armory by Powers. Powers is the cartoonist, so his name is Powers. Art at the Armory by Powers, and then he names himself Futurist. Art at the Armory by Powers, Futurist. And then over here, of course, nobody who has been drinking is let in to see this show. This is the actual installation of the Cubist room at the Armory show. This was in the New York Tribune, February 17, 1913. So this is a work by Duchamp's brother. It's called The Cubist House by Raymond Duchamp Villon. This work, I know you can't read these, but this is the best image you can find today. This is Marcel Duchamp's nude study, Sad Young Man on a Train. Today, this is in the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice from 1911, 1912. This is Man on a Balcony by Albert Gliese. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art today. This is Nude Descending the Staircase. That's in Philadelphia also. And then this is a work by Alexander Archipenko. Here that's called Family Life, and this no longer exists. It was destroyed later, so this no longer exists today. Here's the Griswold cartoon on the left, the Rude descending a staircase, rush hour at the subway. Everybody clobbering everybody with their newspapers. The New York Times. This is the New York Times that called it an explosion in a shingle factory. It's with the Nude descending a staircase. Once Duchamp goes through this, Cézanne, Picasso, Futurism, etc., all of that is about painting. And by 1913, this no longer interests him. This has all been done. It doesn't matter, Futurism, Cubism. So he starts to challenge the basic assumptions of traditional approaches to painting and sculpture. He's in America now. He's from Paris. He comes to New York. He's part of New York Dada. He's fascinated by American culture, or lack thereof, all these cheap and easy reproductions of things, all this mass production of consumer goods and objects. So he begins to totally rethink what he wants to do, and he essentially moves away from a more creative, perceptual approach to art to something that's more conceptual. So he turns, when he thinks about all of these commercially produced objects in the United States, the thing he thinks America's greatest contribution to culture is plumbing. That when it comes to plumbing, nobody has it on America. So he starts to look at things, and he creates the concept of the ready-made, which is to say commercially produced objects that he just presents as works of art because they've been selected by him, and he's an artist. He might alter the work. If he alters the work in some fashion, he might write something on it or change it in some way. then it's called a ready-made aided or assisted. If he just flat puts the thing out there, then it's just a ready-made. So among the most famous was the urinal that you see here. And Duchamp founds a periodical, a magazine that's called, as you can see here, The Blind Man, which is a great title for a visual arts magazine. The Blind Man, right? And he had a very open editorial policy. Basically, anybody who submitted anything got it published. That was, I wish he was still around today. The inaugural issue appeared on April 10th, 1917, but then the second issue is this one here on the left. And this is the one that dealt with the scandal of the urinal, which he had titled Fountain, and had tried to have it exhibited at the the Society of Independent Artists in New York in 1917, but the jury rejected it, obviously. That caused a huge kind of scandal. And so the second issue of Blind Man was devoted to telling that story. And it was, he had taken this urinal and he had dated it and he had signed it, R. Moot, for Richard Moot. But Moot was a play on the word in American plumbing, for those of you who know the history of American plumbing. Mott, M-O-T-T, was a very important plumbing firm in America. So he was making that reference, but he changed it. But now this article is defending, of course, somebody who doesn't exist, Richard Moot, who had made this sculpture, but of course Duchamp had presented. In other words, you start to see what we're talking about. This is all kind of going on in your head. It's not something that's sort of visual. And then he got Stieglitz to photograph it. This is a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz. So to make sure we got a good photographer, as if he's shooting a great work on a pedestal. So Stieglitz took this photograph, and then it goes into this journal. So the whole concept of the ready-made was a direct assault on traditional aesthetics, traditional ideas of art and quality and all of these things. And it does forever change the nature of how we think about art and what art can be. That gets further dealt with here. This is Duchamp's, the title is right here at the bottom, these initials, LHOOQ, from 1919, just a couple of years after the urinal, and there were other ready-mades, the bottle rack, the snow shovel, the bicycle wheel is among the most famous on the stool, right? Those are all ready-mades. This is what we would call a ready-made aided or assisted, because he took a commercial, people think it was a postcard, but in fact it wasn't a postcard, but it was a commercial reproduction, small, of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And then he put a mustache and a goatee on it in pencil. And then he added those initials at the bottom, LHOOQ. So here, Duchamp is very smart. I mean, he's very intelligent, and now he's moving into the realm where he's totally into a conceptual realm of ideas. And so what he is essentially saying now is that he comes right out and says that he's against any art that is now based on retinal sensation. That's the term he uses. So if it's the tradition of looking and about art and color and design and all that brushwork, texture, that's done. And now what he wants is an art that's in service to the mind. So it's art that's going to be the point of departure for us to think, and in our heads to challenge ourselves and to come up with new ways of thinking about things. So to that extent, when he places these initials on this cheap reproduction of one of Western culture's greatest icons, right, the Mona Lisa, people think of Western art, Western culture, she's like the epitome of it. Everybody's written about it. People have fainted over her. The Victorians talking about her enigmatic smile and all of that. So Marcel Duchamp is going to investigate that. Maybe we can figure out why she's smiling and all of that. So with these initials, if you phonetically pronounce those initials in French, LHOOQ, you say those initials and those letters in French, it sounds like you're saying, translated into English, she has a hot ass. Elle a chaud au cul. She has a L-H-O-O-Q. It would be also, for example, in English, if you were to pronounce those initials in English, what would the word be? Look, right. Look. So it even works in English where he's saying, look at this. Because in English it would be look. If you were to pronounce those words, it sounds like in French, those letters, it sounds like you're saying the phrase, she has a hot ass. Although Duchamp, when asked about that, said he also thought it was a very loose translation for there is a fire down below. I love this guy. You gotta love this guy. So he takes the Mona Lisa and turns her into nothing more than a kind of graffiti subway defilement that somebody might do in the subway. And so he's dealing here, though, with a lot of themes. The iconic nature of this painting, the importance of this painting to Leonardo, its connections to the idea that Leonardo was homosexual and that it has this feminine connotation for Leonardo. It relates back to Duchamp, who used to like to cross-dress and, in fact, created a whole female character that he named Rose C'est la Vie. C'est la Vie is such is life, but that was her last name. You remember we talked about Kokoschka's Alma Mahler doll? Well, that was a doll, but Rose C'est la Vie was Duchamp dressed up as a woman. He would go out, and you could call him up and say, you know, is Rose there? And then, you know, you could talk to Rose, and then you could say, look, you want to go out tonight, have a few drinks, whatever, and he would come out as Rose C'est la Vie. So there was this whole feminine alter ego. So he was playing with issues of gender and all of that as well, and all of that is represented essentially here. This is the Dada room, part of it. And here on the wall, although this is a different installation shot here on the wall, is one of the few works we have by Duchamp in our collection. It's the second work by Duchamp to come into our collection, and it's The Fresh Widow. The original one was fabricated in 1920. Ours is 1964. Duchamp gave permission and oversaw 8 reproductions of this. They're not really reproductions, but an edition of 8 later in 64. And ours is the second of those 8 that were produced in 1964. But this was originally conceived in 1920, just after the LHOOQ. Fresh Widow is, again, Duchamp is fascinated by language. He's fascinated by how language can be manipulated, misinterpreted. What does it mean if I say, I'm not going to go there. In any case, I'm starting to have my own. So Duchamp created this title, Fresh Widow, by dropping the N from the word French and dropping the N from the word window. So when you drop the N's from those 2 words, you have what sounds like fresh widow instead of French window. It certainly applies to the idea of French doors, French windows, so that still kind of resonates there, that are very common in Parisian apartments. But in 1920, what this could also refer to, fresh widow, were all the widows of soldiers who had been killed in the First World War, that we had now a lot of fresh widows because their husbands had been killed in the war. And the sheathing of these panes of glass in this black Moroccan leather is black. You can't see through it. And black, of course, is like the veils of mourning that widows would wear once they heard that they had lost their loved one in the war. Of course, fresh widow could also be that you're fresh, that you're cheeky, that you're kind of looking for action. That idea. So you could be a widow, but maybe now you're a fresh widow. I'm looking for a replacement. That kind of thing. So all of this confronts us with words, language, how art evokes thought, conceptual ideas, not so much, again, the idea of craftsmanship, making something, finished, technique, and all of that. In fact, this was outsourced to be made by an American carpenter who actually did it. But then Duchamp, you can see down here. Duchamp signs it. He hand paints his name and a copyright, but it's copyrighted Rose C'est la Vie, not Marcel Duchamp. So actually, Rose made this, which is only appropriate because if it's dealing with widows, Rose should work on it, that kind of thing. So that's what you see. So as I said, this is one of two works we have by Duchamp in our collection. This came into the collection second to the first that I'll show you well, here it is here. The first work to come into our collection by Duchamp is this one on the right. And this is the so-called Box in a Valise from 1961. This is a combination of things. It's a light green cloth-covered case that contains miniature replicas, photographs, black and white color reproductions of almost all of Duchamp's works. It's almost like his resume in a box. If you wanted to go somewhere and say, and somebody says, show me your portfolio, he could open this thing up and then it expands, and everything that he had created is somehow represented in that box. And of course, prominent, right here, here's the bottle rack, other things. Prominent is this work that's today in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, Even, subtitled The Large Glass, from 1915 to 1923. This is Duchamp's masterpiece. It's one of the greatest works of the 20th century. It has so much provocative meaning and connotation to it. I don't have time. I mean, literally, one can spend 16 weeks on this. I have done that, 16 weeks on this one work in a seminar. It has that amount of material to discuss. But Duchamp created this work between 1915 and 1923. He stopped working on it in 1923, and he declared that at that point it was definitively unfinished. A few years later, it went off to be, the only time it was exhibited, it went off to the Brooklyn Museum of Art in 1926-27. It was, the only time it was exhibited was at this exhibition. It finished at the exhibition, and then when they were transporting it back, they dropped it. And when they dropped it, it broke. All the glass broke here, and these were all loose shards of glass, because at that time it was not in this aluminum frame. So Duchamp had every piece of glass collected, and then he spent another few years reconstructing the glass, putting every piece back. And then when he noticed what a beautiful pattern it was, that it connected this part with this part through this arc, he then declared that the work had been finished by chance. Now he considered it finished, because it had been dropped accidentally by chance, and chance had finished the work, not the artist. He published another work, it's called The Green Box, came out in 1934, and The Green Box is nothing more than a big box of all of his notes about the large glass, and it tells you every little character and where it came from. These are mannequins, this is a chocolate grinder. All of these things that he saw that then started to work through his mind and become part of this larger ensemble. What is the story of the large glass? What's the meaning of the large glass? Essentially, not to put a fine point on it, it's the sex act. And it's a futile, mechanical sex act. These are the bachelors. This is the bride here. This is the sort of, shall we say, sex machine here. The bride lets out this sort of aura to show that she is excited. When she lets out this aura of excitement, the bachelors get all excited and they start flowing juices to this machine. These are siphons, cones that are in a kind of a helicopter thing above the chocolate grinder, which is down here. This is very accurate to the chocolate grinder he saw in a window in France, in Paris. And then these are going to take the love. I'm kind of using Duchamp's terminology here, so don't get upset with me. Then these things are going to take the love juice and going to squirt it up this way to inseminate the bride. Of course, this is totally non-functional. This is the least functional way to to have sexual intercourse, shall we say. And so, in essence, what Duchamp was saying here is, in this world that we live in, why even procreate? This is a world that has gone mad. It is a world of machines and mechanics. There's no reason anymore to even consider these kinds of subjects: man, woman, bride, love, all of these things. And so it has profound. This painting, this work is not even a painting; it's a construction, I guess. It has profound implications. By the way, it consists of oil paint, varnish, lead foil, lead wire, and dust. When it started to get dusty, he fixed the dust to the surface, because that's chance as well. It got dusty. So, okay, let's leave the dust. I didn't do justice to that, but that's because basically I'm out of time, and we haven't even done surrealism. So I'm going to stick around for a few more minutes here and talk about surrealism. Here is André Breton on the right, photograph of Breton glasses from 1924, and then here is the cover of the Surrealist Manifesto from 1924. December, comes out on December 1st, 1924. So what we have with surrealism is exactly what we have with futurism, which is to say the first thing that's produced is a manifesto. And at the time these manifestos come out, Futurist Manifesto comes out in 1909, Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, there is no such thing as futurist painting or surrealist painting. The artists then read this manifesto and what it advocates, and then you see paintings trying to fulfill what the manifesto sort of claims. And among the most important, and again, surrealism begins exclusively with writers and poets, not with visual artists. And what the most famous line in the manifesto is when Breton says what surrealism is, quote, psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Reason should have no play in this, aesthetic should have no play in this, and morality should have no play in this. It is the pure psychic automatism of the thoughts that come from deep in our subconscious. That's what should be expressed either in words or eventually, as he says here, other means. Painters take it up to mean that they can explore this as well. So here's our surrealist room. That's just across now, the space from the Dada section. Surrealism is the most important European art movement between the two world wars. That's a given. But what happens with surrealism when it is created, and I'm talking now in the visual arts, in painting, sculpture, it almost immediately splits into two camps. The artists go one way or they go another way, and it reflects the two sides of the movement that had been expressed by Breton in the manifesto. The first side, there was this emphasis on the dream and on the Freudian part of surrealism. So what you see is a number of artists who are attracted to the Freudian dream concept of dredging the unconscious in the dream state, that whole thing, which is a very big part of the manifesto that Duchamp writes. So here you can have painters who will paint realistically, or if not realistically, meticulously. You can see everything, but you can't figure out what the heck it's about. So the three artists in that camp would be Max Ernst, René Magritte, and Salvatore Dali. When you look at those paintings by Magritte, you can see everything. You know, it's an apple on a guy's head wearing a bowler hat. You know, he's sitting on a railroad, you know, this, that, and the other thing. He's sitting on a train that's coming through the chimney. You can see all that, but then you say, okay, what the hell does it mean? And it's like it was plucked from a dream. So that's the Freudian side. The other side of the movement is the side that stressed what Breton said in that first phrase, pure psychic automatism, which meant automatic techniques in art, techniques that try to subvert, circumvent thought process, where you are at your most pure, you're the purest state of expression. So this leads to a whole host of automatic techniques that essentially reinforce the other side of surrealism, which is abstraction. And the artists who would be on that side of the equation would be Yves Tanguy, Joan Miro, Kay Sage, Mata, the Chilean artist, and Arshile Gorky. They are the sort of more purely abstractionists. Now, the guy who straddles both camps, it's hard to get him pegged down, is Ernst. Max Ernst actually straddles both camps, and he's important in many, many ways. So this is the room. This is looking into a different room here, but this is the Miro farm, Giacometti here. Here's a Man Ray photograph, members of the Surrealist group in 1924. Again, almost everybody here is a writer or a poet. There's one notable exception. Anybody know who this guy is? I'll give you a hint. He painted that. Yeah, it's Giorgio de Chirico, the Italian metaphysical painter. Giorgio de Chirico is not a surrealist. He's often thought of as a surrealist, but he was one of the few visual artists. The surrealists created a whole pantheon of artists that they thought were their predecessors, going back historically to artists like Goya and others, who they thought had a surrealist sensibility. But in more recent days, the one painter that they felt who had a similar kind of sensibility, although he's never part of surrealism, he hangs out with them. But all of his work is prior to 1924, and that's the Italian Giorgio de Chirico. So that's who that is there. This is Breton. This is Breton's wife here. And then one of the greatest poets in Western poetry, in my estimation, is this guy, and that's Robert Desnos. Desnos is the poet who would fall asleep and write poetry and then recite poetry while he was sleeping. His poetry is gorgeous. If you don't know this guy, D-E-S-N-O-S, Robert Desnos, you should look at his poetry. Here, again, in this photograph, in the back row, left to right, this is Man Ray, this is Arp, this is Tanguy, this is André Breton, this is Tristan Tzara, Salvatore Dali is there, Paul Eluard, poet, Max Ernst, and the guy on the far right is René Crevel. This is a photograph by Man Ray in 1930. This photograph, front row is Tzara again, Breton, Salvatore Dali, Max Ernst, Man Ray. Then back here, going across is Eluard, Arp, that's Arp back there, Tanguy, and then René Crevel. Now, I want to talk about automatism, because this is among the most important gifts to later painting in the 20th century, especially for the New York School abstract expressionists. So you have a whole host of automatic techniques that the surrealists explore, and actually many of them are explored first in written form, like parlor games, and then they translate into visual art. So this is André Masson, M-A-S-S-O-N, called Automatic Drawing from 1924. It's at MoMA today. And on the right is Hans Arp, or Jean Arp, Automatic Drawing, 1917 to 18. And what you get, especially with this automatic drawing, is the idea, and we do this in art class today, those of you who've taken drawing classes and whatnot, you just sit down in front of a piece of paper, you have a pencil in your hand, and put the pencil on the paper, and then you just kind of go into a Zen state, try to clear your head of any preconceptions or ideas or things, and then when you feel ready, you just start moving your pencil on the paper, and you cannot lift the pencil. It has to stay on the paper, and when you do lift the pencil, you're done. And then you look at the drawing, and normally there's going to be some interesting things in there that you can then work into and begin to sort of elaborate on, but the idea is that this came from an unpremeditated state of your deeper subconscious, that concept. Or in the case of Arp over here as well, he began to just be inspired by shapes like branches and roots, sand dunes, tracks in the sand, grasses, etc. And then these would evoke in his mind certain shapes that he would just do and then sort of explore as well. So, automatic drawing. Then we have exquisite corpse and decalcomania. So here on the left Exquisite corpse is simply where more than one artist contributes to the work, but they don't know what the previous artist has drawn. So you have a piece of paper, again, you may have done this in an art class or in a party when everybody's drunk. You just get a piece of paper, somebody draws something, then they fold it over and just show a few lines that are there, and give it to the next person, who then adds to it, and they fold it over and give it to the next person, and you just go around the room, and everybody adds, and then you open it up, and this is what you get. Here, now this was an exquisite corpse that was contributed to by Yves Tanguy, Joan Miro, Max Maurice, and Man Ray. They're all the 4 artists present here, and the title is Nude from 1926-27, and it's ink, pencil, and colored pen. And if I pass it to you, you could use any tool. You could use a crayon or a pencil or a pen, whatever you want to use. This actually starts as a word game. Almost all of these things start as word games, where I write a line of poetry, or not, it doesn't have to be poetry, I just write a line. I get quiet in front of my piece of paper, some phrase pops into my head, I write it down, I fold it over, give it to the next person, they do the same thing, and then we just send it around. Then we open it up and read it as if it were one written poem. And the term exquisite corpse was chosen to be the term to describe this kind of effort, because in one of these word experiments, the phrase, "the exquisite corpse shall drink the young wine," that popped up. And when they heard this word, exquisite corpse, they liked it. So they gave it the name of everything. That's what we're going to call this, the exquisite corpse. Decalcomania, this is a work by Oscar Dominguez from 1936. So we have automatic drawing, exquisite corpse, and now decalcomania. And this is pretty simple. You take could be a piece of paper, a piece of canvas, whatever, and you work on it with anything, watercolor, oil, usually oil. Then you take another, let's say it was on canvas, then you take another canvas and you squish it on top like a sandwich. And you just press it down. Then you peel it off, and then you look at what has happened to that smudged kind of paint. And usually certain shapes or textures come through. So this is done here in the Dominguez with ink. That's an ink decalcomania here. Now, the artist who is the most energetic, important, original, committed to automatic techniques is Max Ernst. So here is Ernst in some bad photographs, showing you some of his automatic techniques that relate to this kind of image here. The image on the right is called The Entire City from 1934. It's at the Tate in London. It's oil on paper that was laid over a canvas, so that's the final sort of material. But Ernst explores a couple of different techniques. He explores frottage and grattage. Frottage is when you've probably all done this in school and you didn't realize it when you were in elementary school, and the teacher put a nickel or a quarter down on the table and put a piece of paper over that, and then he gave you your pencil and you just went over the nickel, and then of course it started to show up on the paper, right? So that's frottage. Grattage, you see the word grate, grattage is essentially what that means. It's scraping, where you put a material on, you have a canvas, put some oil, let's say oil paint, put something over that, and then you scrape across that. You're scraping, and then you lift it up. Now here you can see he's making a pattern off of a plank of wood. This is grattage. This is a wood plank that has a grain. It's very rough. He places his paper or canvas, looks like maybe canvas, and then with material he's trying to see what emerges from these grains. Same thing here, right? And that gives you this effect here. It gives you this effect of something that looks sort of, it's an automatic technique. You can't control it that thoroughly, but it creates these incredible textures. Very often they look exactly like what they came from, a plank of wood, or et cetera. So for example, he does a series called the Forest series. And all the trees look like they have wood grain because they were all done on a plank of wood, like that. Now we didn't have it up prior to the renovation, but now we have this great Ernst up, A Moment of Calm, from 1939. And this employs both frottage and grattage in passages when you see these patterns. But Ernst doesn't stop there. This is a zoomorphic couple on the left from 1933 at the Guggenheim. And then very important painting, Surrealism and Painting on the right from 1942. That's at the Menhill Collection in Houston. Frottage is this kind of rubbing that we talked about. Grattage is this kind of scraping. Very often associated. What really first gives him the idea of this is that being in his studio one day and looking down at his floorboards in his studio. And they all had this interesting grain. So he started to throw down pieces of paper on the studio floor and just started sort of rubbing with pencil or whatever to see these textures coming forward. And then he was amazed when he discovered that in Leonardo da Vinci's treatise on painting, Leonardo advised people to do that. And Leonardo went further. He said you should really look at stains on walls and see what that stain might evoke in you. So Leonardo was ahead of Max Ernst on a lot of this, as he was with a lot of other things. This is interesting. See this patterning here? Now, this is not frottage and it's not grattage. This is where he would take twine, string, right? And he would put it underneath the canvas, right? And then he would paint over it. And of course, it would start to pick up all these irregular strands that were underneath that were affecting the way the paint looked. So this is the result of string, essentially, beneath the canvases, and then rubbed pigment over the surfaces. And then he changed that, let me make sure I get this right, is when he then first the string was underneath the canvas, then he decided, you know what, I'm going to put it on top of the canvas. And he would lay it out on top of the canvas. And then he would spray paint around the twine and then pull it off. And you would have this other kind of texture. So he's obsessive about these concerns. This is fascinating because it says surrealism in painting. And it shows this kind of weird, and a lot of these forms, he was obsessed with the form of the bird. And anytime he could work into a work that kind of turns it into a predatory or a strange mythic bird, he does so. But this is an interesting work because this creature, this form, it has at first we think it's a pencil. And what you think is happening here is an automatic drawing. In other words, he's showing you this is an automatic technique. And I titled this painting Surrealism and Painting. But in fact, when you look closely, he's not holding a pencil, he's actually holding a very fine brush. But nonetheless, what he's doing here is very much an automatic approach. And then we get to an even more interesting one. This is all Max Ernst. That's why this guy's so important. We get to something like this. This is The Bewildered Planet from 1942. It's at the Tel Aviv Museum. This is one of the first paintings he creates when he comes to the States in 1941. It has aspects of automatism and decalcomania and a new technique that I haven't mentioned, and that is oscillation. What he does now is, first of all, this is all decalcomania, where he just put the color down and then he squished another canvas on top of it to smudge it so it looks like these sort of stalactites and stalagmites and things. We have large degrees of automatic drawing in here, but more importantly are these rhythms. And here what he does is he puts the canvas on the floor and he takes a can of paint and he ties it to a string and he punctures a hole in the bottom of the can of paint, and then he just oscillates and swings the can, right, into arcs and rhythms so that it dribbles out. This is before Jackson Pollock. But that's a surrealist automatic technique, is oscillation. And that's what's going on here. All this. Magritte is one of we call sometimes these two modes of surrealism the veristic, the realistic, and the abstract. Magritte is certainly within the realm of the veristic because you get these incredibly specific, beautifully rendered paintings and images. This is the human condition that we have at the gallery from 1933, and the blank signature that we have at the gallery from 1965. So you can see everything. It's not like you can't see things. It's a horse, it's a rider, it's a forest, it's grass, it's an easel, it's a painting, it's drapes. It's not like it's abstract in that sense. But then you look at it, and it's called the human condition, and then you have to really start thinking, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's an easel in front of a window, but this is a painting that's in front of the window. It seems to match up with what's outside the window. But in fact, if I took this painting away, why would I believe that that's what's behind this painting? There could be a factory back there. So he's playing with levels of perception and of cognition about art and ideas. So all of that, same the way she kind of bleeds through the forest here. So that's a different thing. It's veristic, it's realistic, but it opens up and asks more questions than it answers. We do not have a great 1930s Dali painting. When Dali is committed to surrealism, it's the decade of the 30s, his greatest pictures. After that, Dali goes off on a lot of tangents that aren't necessarily the best tangents. In any case, in the 30s, he's a very important part of surrealism. And those paintings that he produces in the 30s, persistence of memory, et cetera, are really top-notch. But we do have some prints. This is Fantastic Beach Scene on the left from 1935 by Dali. It's an etching. And then Grasshopper Child from 1933. Grasshopper Child, this idea of montage, things changing to other things, this is why surrealism would eventually begin to explore cinema, because there's no place you can show transformation better than in cinema, the montage of something, a kid transforming into a grasshopper or vice versa or whatever. Miro is associated with surrealism. Of course, we have the great sort of pre-surrealist painting of the farm from 2122, when he's very much painting in a very realistic, even if it is somewhat magic realism, in the sense that everything is so clear and crisp. It's this beautiful hymn to his native Catalonia, to his native farm where he grew up. It's all very detailed, very much, again, clear, abstract, and formal geometric shapes. But eventually, within a few years, this is 1921-22, by 1924, he's been appropriated by André Breton. Breton has seen some of his most important paintings, the Tilled Field and others that we had in the big Miro show that we did here a few years ago. And Miro has moved to something like this. This is the head of a Catalan peasant from 1924, just a few years after the farm. And he's abandoned that kind of realist manner of the farm to embrace much more automatism, abstraction, ambiguity, things. This is the little hat of the Catalan peasant, the little baratina that they wear in Catalonia. These are supposed to be the eyes. This could be the beard, but it could also be furrows in a field. So you start to sense all of that kind of ambiguity, and it looks sort of, again, sort of dreamlike. Yves Tanguy and Kay Sage, same way, but they create this dreamscape, is the only way I can describe it. It looks like a lunar surface almost. This is Look of Amber on the left by Yves Tanguy from 1929, and A Finger on the Drum on the right by Kay Sage from 1940. Of course, they marry, their husband and wife. And in fact, it's interesting, they hang next to each other, and they never wanted that. So we're kind of violating a personal request that they never hang next to each other. They wanted to be their own artists, it's just understandable. But they create these beautiful illusionistic sort of lunar surfaces, seem sucked of air, there's no atmosphere, very evocative again. I'm not going to talk, I've been holding off to talk about sculpture towards the end, but we do have this great Giacometti that's in the Surrealist rooms, as it should be, because it's a Giacometti from 1935. Giacometti comes into the Surrealist circle, he's noticed by Breton, because Breton sees the most important Surrealist works by Giacometti, which are these works that are very strange. The most famous one, arguably, is Woman with Her Throat Cut. That's at MoMA. That shows that they're meant to be seen on the floor, and it looks like a kind of crustacean with a razor blade. And it doesn't look like it came from a dream. It looks like it came from a nightmare. And he did a series of these small works, little cage-like works, and that's what Breton was fascinated by. So Giacometti becomes a very important, in the 20s, a very important part of surrealism. This is right at the end. This is 1935. And he does this wonderful figure, the invisible object, hands holding a void. And this is the end of his surrealist days, because once Breton saw that Giacometti was going back to the human figure and going back to using a live model, which now he was very often using a live model, he expelled Giacometti. And he did it in a really horrible way. It was, I actually think, I have to go back and check, but I think it was Giacometti's birthday. And they were in Paris, and Breton said, come, we're going to have a big celebration. And, so Giacometti shows up, he opens the door, he goes into this room, all of his friends are there on this table, on this dais, and Breton just lets him have it and expels him. And these were all of his friends who were now saying, forget it, you're no longer part of us. And so Giacometti goes into a different direction then. But I wanted to mention something about this figure in relationship to the imagery and relating directly to the First World War. Because certainly Giacometti was aware of the gas mask because of all of these horrific events of using mustard gas and other kinds of poison gas. Poison gas was first used on the Western Front in 1915. It was used by the Germans against Canadian and French troops. And each country had its own type of gas mask. So this is an American gas mask, this is a French, this is British, and this is German. And certainly Giacometti was aware of how people looked in these gas masks. Most of the surrealists were. And they looked like sort of these strange aliens from another land, and that clearly related to the face here. Peggy Guggenheim is pivotal because she, of course, has this long involvement with all of these important painters and artists. This is Guggenheim with a Calder from 1941, and that's Peggy Guggenheim in Venice on the right in 1949. She had amassed a huge art collection, both while she was in Europe and then she was in America, around between 38 and 46. She was very close friends with Marcel Duchamp. She was one of the great promoters of Duchamp's career. She marries Max Ernst, so they're married between 1941 and 1946. She's in New York in 1941, and she opens up what's one of the great, of course, modern art galleries of the 20th century called the Art of this Century, in which she now becomes a kind of patroness for all of these great modern artists, but especially for all of the European emigres, all of these European artists who had left Europe as the Second World War was now looming. So this is the famous photograph from 1942 called Artists in Exile. This was an actual exhibition put together by Pierre Matisse, the son of Henri Matisse, who had a gallery in New York, the Pierre Matisse Gallery. He knew all these guys through his father. And so they had all now come to the United States to flee the effects of the Second World War and the rise of Nazism. So here, front row, going across, we have Mata, Zadkin, Yves Tanguy, Max Ernst, Marc Chagall, Fernand Léger. In the second row, Breton came, there he is. Next to him is Pete Mondrian, André Masson, Amédée Ossifant, Jacques Lipschitz, Pavel Chelechu, Kurt Seligman, and then at the end is Eugene Behrman. All of these artists transplanted to America. This is one of the greatest brain drains in European art history. They all came. I'm not even going to get into the brain drain of art historians. We would not have art history in America without the brain drain of great scholars who came to this country at that time as well, like Erwin Panofsky and others, Richard Krautheimer. In any case, they all come and settle in New York. Every important European art movement is represented by somebody now. You want to learn about the style? I think I'll talk to Mondrian. You want to learn about surrealism? I think I'll talk to Breton. So the young Americans now have access to this information for the very first time directly. Many Americans had never even been to Europe. Here's Artists in Exile again. This time it's a photograph at Peggy Guggenheim's apartment in 1942. In the front row, going across this way, Stanley William Hayter, Leonora Carrington, who later marries Max Ernst, Frederick Kaiser, Kurt Seligman in the second row, going this way. Max Ernst, Amédée Osenfant, André Breton, Fernand Léger, Berenice Abbott is down there. Third row is Max Ernst's son, Jimmy Ernst. Jimmy Ernst, Peggy Guggenheim, John Farron, Marcel Duchamp, and Pete Mondrian. And then interesting is the relationship here between Mata, the Chilean artist, on the left, who emigrates to the United States, and his photograph is 1939, and one of the great painters that I have a particular affection for, as many of you know, Arshile Gorky, the Armenian-American. This is a photograph from Life magazine in 1940. Gorky occupies a particularly important position. He has emigrated long before all of this World War II period. He emigrates in 1926, so he's come to America, to New York in 26. He actually comes to Boston first, even before that. So he's already on the scene. But now he meets Mata, this Chilean painter, who begins to sort of, again, teach him a lot about what was going on in Europe with Surrealism. He meets André Breton. Of course, Gorky works consistently through all these Europeans. He has his Cézanne phase, his Miro phase, his Picasso phase. I tell the story, you know the story, when he was showing his portfolio around before he was sort of well known, and he wanted to get a show. He went to the gallery dealer, and the gallery dealer's looking through his stuff, and Gorky says, "I used to be with Cézanne, but now I'm with Picasso." And then the guy gave him his stuff back and said, "Come back when you're with Gorky." In other words, once you work through all that, that's fine. But then come back when you're yourself. You found your own voice. Gorky and Mata have a checkered history. They hang together in the gallery now, but not in the Surrealist gallery. They hang in the New York School galleries. So here is Mata's Genesis from 1942. This is one of our paintings, hanging next to Gorky's One Year the Milkweed from 1944. Gorky has already approached many Surrealist automatic techniques, allowing the paint to run and dribble. High degree of spontaneity, automatism, the effects of the accident and chance. When Breton sees Gorky's work, because Breton is now in New York, and Breton discovers, or at least he thinks he sort of discovers Gorky in a certain way, and he says, "You may not know this, but you're a Surrealist." And Gorky says, "Okay, great. If you give me a show, you can call me anything you want." So now we have Gorky in the Surrealist circle, and here is Gorky with his daughter, with André Breton, here at Gorky's house in Roxbury, Connecticut, 1945. This is the famous farewell dinner. I'm not going to go into all the machinations here because I'll start to cry about Gorky and Mata, but Breton here was in New York, and he was about to go on a extended trip, a cultural tour. He was going to go to Haiti and the French West Indies on behalf of the French embassy. So it was decided to give him a farewell party in New York at a restaurant called the Parisienne on West 46th Street, and everybody came to that party. So here is Breton, and going around the table this way, we have Breton. This is Mogouche, who is Gorky's wife. This is Max Ernst that you see there. Then going around, we have Breton, Mogouche, Becky Reese, Elisa Breton, his sister. Patricia Mata is here. That's Mata's wife. Frederick Kaiser, Nina Label. Mata is here. Marcel Duchamp is here. And standing back here is Gorky here. Of course, there was a huge, what shall we call it, triangle going on between and among Gorky, Mata, and Gorky's wife. Just one of a number of problems he had at that time. But in any case, Gorky is brought into Surrealism, and he becomes, when we think about Gorky today, you can label, if you have to pigeonhole Gorky, and art historians like to put everybody in a little box, Gorky is either the last Surrealist or the first abstract expressionist. So he's all in on Surrealism under Breton, but then it'll be Gorky who befriends Willem de Kooning. So here is Gorky with de Kooning with this painting. That's our painting. That's hanging in the East Building. That is in a different state of completion than the way it looks today. This is a photograph from 1937. This relationship is very close. Gorky and de Kooning become very close friends. And this leads us straight to the generation that is going to inherit all of the surrealist ideas and go beyond those, and that's the New York school, the abstract expressionists. So here is the famous Life magazine photograph from 1951 that was titled The Irascibles. And so on the front row is Theodore Stamos, Jimmy Ernst, Barnett Newman, James Brooks, and Mark Rothko. In the middle row is Richard Poussin-Dart, William Baziotis, Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, Robert Motherwell, and Bradley Walker Tomlin. And in the back row, Willem de Kooning, Adolf Gottlieb, Ad Reinhardt, and Hedda Stern. So that's the story that leads then ultimately to the New York School. So thanks, everybody. I went way over.